What are wages? Different workers earn different amounts depending on their industry and the task they complete. Despite the variations, they all agree wages are money paid by an employer in exchange for work performed. Selling labor seems straightforward, but it's actually labor power being sold. Labor power is a commodity just like sugar, bought by the capitalist for a set price, wages, and used for a set time. Just like sugar has a price, labor power has a price, wages, determined by the amount of time the worker is used. Workers exchange their labor power, a commodity, for the capitalist's money, another commodity. This exchange happens at a specific rate. Money for a set amount of labor power use, e.g., 2 shillings for 12 hours of weaving. Those 2 shillings aren't just money. They represent the purchasing power to buy other goods with that amount. In essence, the worker trades their labor power for various goods, not just money. The 2 shillings become the measure of how labor power is valued compared to other things, the exchange value of labor power. The value a good or service has when expressed in money is its price. Therefore, wages are just another way of saying price of labor power, even though they're often called simply price of labor. This highlights the unique nature of labor power as a commodity. It exists only within a person. Wages aren't a share of the product the worker makes. Cloth. The capitalist pays wages from their existing funds, not from future sales of the product. This is similar to how they buy yarn and the loom. All are tools, resources for production. The worker, like the loom, is just another tool used in production and doesn't have a stake in the final product or its sale. Workers don't get a cut of the product they make, like the cloth. Their wages come from the capitalist's existing wealth. Wages are simply the payment the capitalist uses to buy a specific amount of a worker's ability to produce labor power, similar to buying materials or tools. Workers sell their labor power because they need to in order to survive and buy necessities. Work as a sacrifice. The worker sells their most fundamental activity, their labor itself, to survive. This essential part of life becomes a sacrifice to secure basic needs. Product versus wages. The actual product the worker creates, silk, gold, holds no value for them. Their focus is solely on the wages earned, which are then used to buy basic necessities, jacket, coins, shelter. Lost meaning. The act of working itself, weaving, building, has no inherent meaning or fulfillment for the worker. It becomes a chore necessary to earn wages, not an expression of their skills or creativity. Life outside work. True life, for the worker, only starts when they are done working at home, socializing, or resting. The work itself is seen as a necessary evil to access this real life. Comparison to silkworm. The analogy of a silkworm working only to survive as a caterpillar emphasizes the repetitive and unfulfilling nature of wage labor for some. Slavery. Slaves weren't selling their labor power. They were property sold entirely. Their labor was an inseparable part of them, just like an ox's work belongs to the farmer. Serfdom. Serfs weren't selling their labor power either. They belonged to the land and owed a portion of their labor, tribute, to the landowner, not receiving wages in return. Free labor. Free workers, however, sell their labor power itself, piece by piece. They essentially auction off specific chunks of their life hours per day to the capitalist who owns the means of production. Freedom with dependence. While free from a single owner, the worker is still dependent on the capitalist class for survival. They can leave one job but must find another buyer, another capitalist, to purchase their labor power or risk not being able to live. Wages as price. The text reiterates that wages are the price of a commodity, labor power. It then foreshadows the next section by posing a question. Price determination. If wages are like other commodity prices, how exactly are those prices determined? By what is the price of a commodity determined? Commodity prices are determined by competition between buyers and sellers. This competition is influenced by the relationship between supply and demand. When there are many sellers offering the same good, they compete to sell theirs for the lowest price to attract buyers. Buyer competition. Buyers also compete, driving prices up. Each buyer wants the good and is willing to offer more than others to secure it. Balance of power. The final price depends on which competition is stronger, sellers trying to sell low or buyers trying to buy high. Analogy. The passage uses an interesting analogy of two armies, sellers and buyers, fighting within themselves, competition among sellers or buyers, and against each other. The army with less internal conflict wins. Stronger competition sets the price. High demand, low supply. When there's a shortage, demand is 10x higher than supply. Buyer competition intensifies. Each buyer desperately tries to secure a piece of the limited supply. Seller advantage. Sellers recognize this intense competition among buyers. They don't need to fight to lower prices because buyers are already driving the price up. Limited by ability to pay. Even though sellers might want sky-high prices, buyers' ability to pay sets a limit. Analogy continued. The passage continues the army analogy. Sellers become a united front, content to let buyers fight for the goods, knowing the price will rise. Supply versus demand. The core principle of supply and demand is re-emphasized. When supply is low and demand is high, seller competition weakens, and buyer competition pushes prices up. Conversely, when there's a surplus, high supply, low demand, seller competition intensifies, driving prices down. Frequency. The passage acknowledges that situations of excess supply are more common, leading to lower prices for buyers. But what is a rise and what a fall of prices? What is a high and what a low price? A grain of sand is high when examined through a microscope, and a tower is low when compared with a mountain. And if the price is determined by the relation of supply and demand, by what is the relation of supply and demand determined? Cost of production. This businessman believes the cost of production sets the baseline for profit. Profit calculation. He calculates profit as the difference between the selling price and the production cost. Gain. If the selling price covers the production cost and allows him to buy other goods with more production cost, presumably higher value, he considers it a gain. Loss. Conversely, if the selling price only allows him to buy goods with lower production cost, he views it as a loss. Price versus production cost. This perspective highlights the tension between desired market price, high, and production cost, low, for businesses. They ideally want to sell high but keep production costs low to maximize profit. Price changes are relative. It reiterates that price changes for one good are relative to other goods. If silk goes up from 2 to 3 shillings, it means the value of silver, used for currency, relative to silk has decreased. Similarly, all other goods with stable prices have effectively decreased in price compared to silk. Resource allocation. A significant price rise for a good, like silk, attracts investment capital into that industry. More people and resources are directed towards producing silk. Market correction. This increased production, due to high profits, eventually leads to a surplus of silk. Following the principles of supply and demand, a surplus will eventually push the price of silk down, potentially even below the cost of production. Low prices and resource withdrawal. When a good's price falls below its production cost, businesses see it as unprofitable. They withdraw capital, resources, from producing that good. Supply reduction. This withdrawal of resources leads to a decrease in the supply of that good. Market correction, again with a lower supply, the principles of supply and demand dictate that the price will eventually rise again. This price increase can continue until it reaches the cost of production, equilibrium, or even surpasses it if demand is very high. Price fluctuation. The passage acknowledges that a good's price can fluctuate above or below its production cost depending on market forces. Capital movement. Capital, resources, constantly move between industries based on profit opportunities. High prices in an industry attract investment, while low prices cause businesses to move resources elsewhere. Demand and cost. Not covered. The passage mentions that cost of production also influences demand, but doesn't elaborate. Presumably, if a good's production cost is very high, the final selling price might be too expensive for many consumers, reducing overall demand. The passage critiques the view of traditional economists, bourgeois economists, on how cost of production affects price. Here's a breakdown. Traditional view. Traditional economists believe the average price of a good tends to settle around its cost of production. They see fluctuations as temporary deviations from this norm. Anarchic movement. The passage disagrees. It views the constant rise and fall of prices, anarchy, as the core mechanism. It argues that these fluctuations eventually force the price back towards the cost of production. Fluctuations as order. The passage suggests these seemingly chaotic fluctuations create a kind of hidden order. Over time, the highs and lows balance each other out, with competition acting as a self-correcting force. Impact of fluctuations. It acknowledges these fluctuations can be destructive, like earthquakes, and destabilize economies. This perspective challenges the traditional economic view of a stable equilibrium price. It highlights the dynamic and potentially disruptive nature of price fluctuations in a free market. Long-term equilibrium. The author argues that while price fluctuations occur, they tend to balance out over the long term for an entire industry, not individual products or companies. Price and cost of production long-term. In the long run, the average price of a good in an industry will gravitate towards its cost of production. Periods of high prices attract investment, increasing supply and driving prices back down. Conversely, low prices lead to decreased production, causing prices to rise again. Industry versus individual. This price-cost of production relationship applies to the entire industry, not individual products or companies within that industry. A specific product within an industry might have price fluctuations that deviate from the industry average. Manufacturer versus manufacturing class. Similarly, the price-cost of production relationship applies to the entire class of manufacturers within an industry, not individual companies. A particular company might experience periods where its production costs are higher or lower than the industry average, impacting its profit margins. Breakdown of cost. It explains that cost of production has two components. Past labor. The cost of raw materials and tools represents the labor time it took to produce them in the past. Direct labor. The cost of the labor directly involved in making the current good. Labor as the core. By combining these two elements, all cost of production can be seen as a reflection of the total labor time required to bring a good to market. By what are wages determined? Wages are determined by supply and demand, just like the price of any other good. This means wages can go up or down depending on how many workers are available, supply, and how many businesses need workers, demand. There are limits to these wage changes though. In the long run, wages will reflect the cost of living for workers, how much it costs them to survive and be able to work. The cost of maintaining the worker. This includes basic necessities like food, shelter, and clothing needed for the worker to survive and function effectively. The cost of education and training. For some jobs, specific skills or knowledge are required. The cost of acquiring these qualifications becomes part of the worker's overall production cost. The key point: jobs with shorter training periods tend to have lower wages because the worker's production cost is lower. Conversely, jobs requiring extensive training or education will likely have higher wages to reflect the greater investment in the worker's capabilities. Manufacturers factor in wear and tear. When calculating production costs, they consider how long machines last, e.g., 10 years, and spread that replacement cost over the product's price, e.g., adding 100 shillings annually. Workers also wear out. The passage argues that workers' abilities deteriorate over time, just like machines. Replacement cost for workers. Similar to machines, the cost of raising new generations of workers, propagation, becomes part of the overall cost of labor power. This concept suggests that wages should, in theory, take into account the cost of raising future generations of workers to replace the current ones. This is a theoretical minimum, not a guarantee. It applies to the entire working class as a whole, not necessarily each individual worker. Many workers might earn less than this minimum. Market forces cause fluctuations just like with other goods. Wages will fluctuate around this minimum based on supply and demand. Essentially, this theory suggests that in a purely market-driven system, wages will naturally gravitate towards a level that allows the working class to survive and reproduce, but not necessarily thrive. It's important to remember this is a specific economic theory, and there are other factors that can influence wages in the real world. The nature and growth of capital. Capitalists say capital is just tools, raw materials, and stuff to keep workers alive, all made by workers. Marx says this ignores the context. A machine is a machine, a person is a person, but under capitalism they are turned into tools for the owner. The passage highlights two key ideas about production. Social nature of production. Humans don't just work with nature, they work with each other. Production requires collaboration, with people interacting and exchanging their activities in a specific way. These social connections and relationships are essential for production to happen. Means of production shapes social relations. The way people interact and relate to each other during production is influenced by the tools and technologies they use, called the means of production. The passage uses the example of firearms. When this new weapon was introduced, it completely changed how armies were organized, how soldiers interacted within an army, and even how different armies interacted with each other. In simpler terms, the tools we use for production not only affect what we make, but also how we make it together. This passage builds upon the previous one by explaining the historical impact of changing means of production. Social relations of production. The way people interact during production, social relations, is constantly evolving as the tools and technologies, material means of production, used for production change and improve. Impact on society. These changing social relations of production don't exist in isolation. They define a society as a whole, shaping its overall structure and characteristics. Historical stages. The passage argues that different historical periods, like ancient society, feudal society, and capitalist society, can be understood by looking at their specific social relations of production. Each stage has a unique way people interact based on the dominant means of production. In simpler terms, the way we produce things not only changes how we work together, but also shapes the entire society we live in at that particular point in history. Here's a breakdown of the passage about capital as a social relation. Capital is more than stuff. The passage argues that capital, often seen as just material things, means of production, is actually a social relationship. It's a specific way of interacting within production, characteristic of bourgeois society, capitalism. Production creates capital. The things that make up capital, means of subsistence, instruments, raw materials, are themselves products of past production under specific social conditions. They are used again for new production, but again within a specific social context. Social character defines capital. It's not just the physical objects, but the social relationships surrounding their production and use that defines them as capital. This social character turns these things into tools for generating profit in a capitalist system. More than physical form, capital isn't limited by the specific physical goods it's invested in. The passage uses the example of cotton versus wool. As long as the exchange value, price, remains the same, capital can exist in different physical forms. It's the value and the social purpose that define capital, not the specific stuff. Focus on exchange value. Capital is also about exchange values, prices of commodities. It's a system where products are not just used, but traded to generate profit. In essence, capital is more than just physical things. It's a social relationship built around using these things within a specific economic system, capitalism, to generate profit through exchange value. The passage clarifies the distinction between a simple sum of commodities and actual capital. Every sum of commodities isn't capital. Just because something has an exchange value, price, and can be traded, doesn't necessarily make it capital. Commodities versus capital. The passage uses examples to illustrate the difference. A house worth £1,000 is still a single commodity with a price tag. Similarly, a penny piece is a single commodity with a small value. Quantity doesn't change the nature. The size or quantity of a commodity doesn't change its basic nature. A large tree and a small tree are both trees, just like a large amount of iron and a small amount of iron are both commodities. Quantity affects value, not type. The passage clarifies that the quantity of a commodity can affect its value, higher or lower price, but not its fundamental nature as a commodity with exchange value. So, what makes something capital? While the passage doesn't explicitly define it here, it hints that capital might involve something more than just being a tradable commodity. It might be related to the specific purpose within a production system geared towards generating profit, as suggested in the previous section. Here's the breakdown of how a sum of commodities becomes capital according to the passage. Key factor: exploitation of labor. The passage argues that a simple sum of commodities becomes capital when it gains the power to exploit living labor. This means using someone else's labor to generate profit for the owner of the capital, commodities. Social power imbalance. The ability to exploit labor comes from an independent social power. This refers to a situation where a class of people, capitalists, owns the means of production, capital, and another class, workers, has nothing but their labor to sell. Domination of past labor. The passage emphasizes that capital represents past accumulated labor that dominates present living labor. The value of the capital grows by using living labor to create more value, essentially exploiting the worker's production capacity. Not just about production. What defines capital is the specific purpose of preserving and multiplying its exchange value through the exploitation of living labor. In simpler terms, capital arises not just from having stuff, commodities, but from the social power it grants to its owner within a system where labor is a commodity to be bought and exploited for profit. Relation of wage labor to capital. Wage labor sells labor power. Capitalist buys it. The worker sells their ability to work, labor power, in exchange for wages, means of subsistence. Worker creates more value than they receive. Through their labor, the worker creates new value, but they only receive enough to survive, not the full value they produce. Worker becomes reliant on capitalist. By selling their labor power, the worker loses control over their ability to produce and relies on the capitalist for survival. The passage uses the example of a farmer and a laborer to illustrate the concept of surplus value in capitalism. The farmer profits. The farmer pays the laborer 1 shilling for a day's work, but the laborer produces crops worth 2 shillings. This means the farmer gets his initial investment back, 1 shilling, plus an extra shilling as profit. Labor creates more value. The key point is that the laborer creates more value than they are paid for. Their labor produces 2 shillings worth of crops, but they only receive 1 shilling to buy necessities. Unequal exchange. This creates an unequal exchange. The farmer consumes the laborer's 1 shilling productively, it generates a profit. While the laborer consumes their 1 shilling unproductively, it just keeps them alive. Capital needs labor, labor needs capital. The passage argues that capitalists need wage laborers to generate this surplus value, and laborers need capitalists to provide them with jobs and wages to survive. They are dependent on each other. Workers produce capital. The example is then expanded to a cotton factory. The passage emphasizes that workers don't just produce goods, like cotton. They also produce capital itself. Their labor creates value that the capitalist can reinvest to keep employing workers and generate even more profit. In short, this passage highlights how capitalism allows owners, farmers, factory owners, to profit from the labor of workers who create more value than they are compensated for. This passage dives deeper into the consequences of surplus value and the relationship between capitalists and workers. Growth of capital. The surplus value extracted from workers' labor fuels the growth of productive capital. This means the capitalist accumulates more resources, money, machines, to expand production and generate even greater profits. Power imbalance. This growth of capital strengthens the power of the capitalist class, bourgeoisie, over the working class. Workers become increasingly dependent on the capitalist for jobs and survival. Alienation. The passage uses the term alien wealth to describe the products workers create. These products become something separate from the workers themselves, alien, and benefit the capitalist, not the worker. False harmony. The idea that the interests of capitalists and workers are aligned is rejected. The passage compares it to the relationship between a loan shark, usurer, and a borrower. They are dependent on each other, but their interests are fundamentally opposed. The worker needs the job, but the capitalist profits from the worker's labor. In simpler terms, this passage argues that capitalism creates a system where the rich, capitalists, get richer by exploiting the labor of the poor workers. Workers become increasingly dependent and powerless as capital grows. The things workers produce don't benefit them, but rather enrich the capitalist class. This passage further emphasizes the unequal relationship between capitalists and workers. Worker dependence. As long as someone relies on wage labor for survival, their fate is tied to the whims of capital. The idea of shared interests between workers and capitalists is seen as empty rhetoric. Growth doesn't benefit workers. Even if the economy grows and there's more demand for labor, the benefits go primarily to the capitalist. The number of workers increases, which strengthens the capitalist's position and control over a larger workforce. Relative deprivation. The analogy of the houses is used to illustrate the concept of relative deprivation. Even if a worker's wages increase, their standard of living might feel worse if the gap between them and the wealthy, the palace, keeps widening. This can lead to dissatisfaction and unrest. In essence, this section argues that economic growth in capitalism doesn't necessarily improve the lives of workers. They might even feel worse off if the wealthy benefit disproportionately. This passage introduces a new factor affecting wages: the value of money itself. Here's the breakdown: more than money. The text acknowledges that wages aren't just about the amount of money received, money price. Inflation example. It uses the historical example of increased gold and silver circulation in Europe. This led to inflation, where the value of those metals used for money decreased. Real wages versus money wages. Even though the workers received the same amount of money, silver coins, their real wages, what they could buy with that money, decreased. They could afford less with the same amount of money. Impact on capitalism. This inflation benefited capitalists. They could pay the same money price for labor, but the workers' buying power decreased. This helped accumulate more capital and strengthen the bourgeoisie. In short, this section highlights how even factors beyond direct wage negotiations can impact worker well-being. Inflation can erode the value of wages and benefit capitalists by lowering their labor costs. The passage provides two more examples to illustrate factors affecting real wages, what workers can buy with their money, beyond just the money price of their labor. Supply and demand of goods. This scenario looks at how the price of essential goods, food, affects real wages. Even if the money wage stays the same, if there's a bad harvest and food prices rise, workers can buy less with their money. Their real wages fall. This reinforces the point that the cost of living plays a big role in determining worker well-being. Technological innovation. This flips the script. Here, imagine new machines or good harvests lead to lower prices for goods. Even if the money wage stays the same, workers can now buy more with their money. Their real wages increase. This highlights how factors outside of direct wage negotiations can benefit workers. In conclusion, this section emphasizes that a worker's real standard of living depends on multiple factors, including money wages, the actual amount of money received, inflation deflation, how much that money can buy over time, cost of living, the price of essential goods and services, worker productivity, how much workers produce can influence wages. This wasn't mentioned in the passage we discussed, but it's another relevant factor. The passage wraps up the key ideas about wages, real versus nominal wages. The text reiterates the distinction between nominal wages, the amount of money, and real wages, what you can buy with that money. It emphasizes that real wages matter more for workers' well-being. Wages represent more than money. The passage suggests there's more to wages than just the money or goods exchanged. It leaves some ideas hanging, implying that wages are part of a larger system of worker-capitalist relations. This could refer to factors like working conditions, power dynamics, or the social meaning of being a wage laborer. This passage dives into the concept of wages in a capitalist system, introducing the idea of relative wages alongside real wages. Wages tied to profit. It argues that wages are ultimately determined by the capitalist's profit motive. Employers will try to keep wages as low as possible to maximize their profits. Relative wages, beyond real wages, what you can buy. The text introduces relative wages. This refers to the worker's share of the value they create compared to the capitalist's share. Imagine a pie representing the total value created by the worker's labor. Relative wages focus on how big of a slice the worker gets compared to the capitalist. In simpler terms, this passage suggests that wages are not just about affording things, but also reflect the power dynamics between workers and capitalists in the production process. Workers are trying to get a bigger slice of the pie they help create, while capitalists aim to keep that pie as large as possible with a smaller portion going to labor. The general law that determines the rise and fall of wages and profits. Wages are not a share of the workers' production. Workers are not compensated based on the value of the goods they produce. Wages are payment for labor power. Workers sell their ability to work, labor power, to capitalists in exchange for wages. Capitalists profit from the difference. The capitalist pays the worker a wage, but sells the good produced by the worker for more than the wage. This difference is the capitalist's profit. Replacement costs. This covers the money spent on raw materials and the depreciation, wear and tear of equipment used in production. The capitalist needs to recover these initial investments. Wages. This is the money paid to the worker for their labor power. Profit. This is the remaining surplus after all the costs are covered. Replacement versus new value. The cost of raw materials and depreciation represents replacing previously existing values. They don't create new wealth. Wages and profit from new value. The worker's labor adds new value to the raw materials through production. Wages and profit are both derived from this new value created by the worker. Shares in the worker's product. Both wages and profit as shares of the value the worker creates. Real versus relative wages. Real wages consider inflation and buying power. Relative wages compare a worker's wage to the capitalist's gain. Example: even if a worker's real wage increases, they can buy more with their money. Their relative wage can decrease. Explanation: if the price of goods drops significantly, 2-3 RDS, but wages only drop a little, 1/3, the capitalist benefits more. Impact: the capitalist's profit increases, 1 shilling. The worker produces more value for less pay, 2 shillings versus 3 shillings. The wealth distribution becomes more unequal, favoring capital over labor. Consequences: the capitalist class gains more power over workers. The workers' social position worsens. Wages and profit move in opposite directions. An increase in one leads to a decrease in the other, and vice versa. Shares of the pie, we can view it as shares of a total value. If the worker's share, wages, increases, the capitalist's share, profit shrinks, and vice versa. This passage acknowledges some exceptions to the strict inverse relationship between wages and profit, but ultimately argues that the outcome is still the same for workers. Here's a breakdown. Capitalist gains outside labor costs. The passage admits that capitalists can increase profit through factors unrelated to wages, such as favorable trade deals with other businesses, increased demand for their products due to new markets or temporary spikes, technological advancements leading to more efficient production. Underlying cause, however, the passage argues that even in these cases, the worker's situation worsens. If the capitalist can buy more goods, exchange values, with the same amount of labor, it means the workers' wages haven't risen proportionally to the increased value they create. In effect, the worker's pay is worth less relative to the profit the capitalist makes. So, while there are ways for capitalists to increase profit outside of direct wage control, the passage argues that it still leads to a situation where the worker's share of the value they create doesn't grow as much as the capitalists. Average price reflects cost of production. The passage argues that in the long run, the average price of a commodity settles based on its cost to produce, not on temporary fluctuations or competition among capitalists. Technological advancements don't increase overall value. Even if advancements like the spinning machine double production, 100 pounds versus 50 pounds of yarn, the total value of those goods in the market won't necessarily double. This is because the cost of production per unit pound of yarn has also decreased by half. These points together suggest that capitalist competition drives efficiency. Competition among capitalists pushes for advancements that reduce production costs. Efficiency doesn't automatically increase profit. While cheaper production might benefit the capitalist initially, the overall market adjusts, and the price of the good falls to reflect the lower cost. Profit grows with capital accumulation. As the gap between wages and profit widens, profit rises compared to wages. The total amount of accumulated wealth, capital, also grows. The interests of capital and wage labor are diametrically opposed effect of growth of productive capital on wages. There's a fundamental conflict between the interests of capitalists, business owners, and workers. Businesses aim for fast profit growth. This can happen when worker wages relative to profits go down. Worker wages can actually increase in real terms, buying power, but still decrease relatively if profits grow much faster. Shifting power. Rapid capital growth strengthens the capitalist's position. They control more resources and have more influence. Greater dependence. Workers become more reliant on capital for jobs and income. This weakens their bargaining power. That's a great summary of the passage. It accurately captures the key points. Unequal gains. Even with wage increases, capital's profits grow much faster, widening the wealth gap between workers and capitalists. Material versus social position. Workers might see some improvement in their standard of living, but their social standing weakens relative to capitalists. Flawed argument. The idea that rapid capital growth benefits workers is misleading. It strengthens the capitalist class at the expense of labor. The passage uses strong metaphors to emphasize this point. Workers are seen as toiling anew at the multiplication of bourgeois wealth, and forging for itself the golden chains by which the bourgeoisie drags it in its train. This imagery highlights how rapid capital growth, while offering some temporary benefits to workers, ultimately strengthens the hold of capitalists over the working class. Economies of scale. Larger businesses have the resources to invest in more gigantic instruments of war, which is a metaphor for more advanced technology and production methods. This allows them to be more efficient. Price war pressure. To win business from competitors, capitalists need to sell more cheaply. Efficiency through labor. The way capitalists achieve lower costs, according to the passage, is by increasing the productive forces of labor. In simpler terms, they need to get more work done by their workers. The passage explains how capitalists might achieve increased efficiency through advancements. Division of labor. Breaking down tasks into smaller, specialized steps is seen as a key method to boost productivity. Machinery. The passage emphasizes the role of machinery and its constant improvement in making production more efficient. Economies of scale. The text suggests that using machinery on a larger scale further reduces production costs. Following this, the passage presents a hypothetical scenario. A capitalist implements these advancements, division of labor, new machinery, efficient use of resources, and can produce twice the amount of goods, e.g., a full yard of linen, in the same amount of time compared to competitors. The question now is, how will this capitalist act in this situation? The answer in the next section will likely explore whether this efficiency gain translates into higher wages for workers or some other outcome. The passage explains the capitalist's likely actions after achieving increased efficiency. Market share, not higher prices. The capitalist won't simply keep the price the same and sell half the amount. Their goal is to expand their market share, not just maintain profit on a smaller volume. Pressure to sell more. The increased production capacity creates pressure to sell more goods, not just maintain existing sales. Undercutting competitors. The capitalist will likely sell the good, e.g., linen, slightly cheaper than competitors, even though it costs less to produce due to the efficiency gains. This allows them to capture market share from competitors who can't match the lower price. Here's the key point. Efficiency gains don't automatically mean higher wages. The passage suggests that even though the capitalist can produce more for less, they are more likely to use this advantage to gain market share through lower prices, not necessarily raise wages for workers. The passage concludes by explaining how the capitalist's advantage is temporary. Competition breeds innovation. Other capitalists will eventually adopt the same efficiency methods, division of labor, machinery, to stay competitive. Price wars erode profits. Once these advancements become widespread, the price of goods, like linen, will likely fall again, potentially even below the new, lower production cost. This implies constant pressure on costs. Capitalists are constantly under pressure to find new ways to be more efficient to maintain profitability. Limited wage gains. The passage suggests that these cost-cutting measures may not translate into higher wages for workers, as the main focus is on lowering prices to win market share. Overall, the excerpt argues that even though growth in productive capital can lead to advancements and efficiency, the benefits may not be shared equally. Workers might see some wage gains, but the main focus seems to be on increasing capitalist dominance through competition and cost reduction. The passage here emphasizes the cyclical nature of competition and efficiency in capitalism. Short-lived advantage. The capitalist's advantage from efficiency gains, cheaper production, is temporary. Other capitalists will adopt similar methods to stay competitive. Price wars resume. Once these advancements become widespread, competition drives prices down again, potentially even below the new, lower production cost. The cycle repeats. This creates a constant loop. Capitalists innovate to gain an edge, competition erodes those gains, pushing everyone to find new efficiencies. The key point here is that pressure on profits, not wages. This constant pressure to reduce costs may not necessarily translate into higher wages for workers. The main focus remains on lowering prices to maintain market share. The passage suggests that advancements in capital might benefit capitalists more in terms of competition and market dominance, while worker wage gains might be limited or secondary in this system. Effect of capitalist competition on the capitalist class, the middle class, and the working class. Capitalist production constantly changes and grows. More division of labor leads to even more division of labor. Using machines leads to using even more machines. Production keeps getting bigger and bigger. This is a law that forces capitalists to keep improving production methods. Even the most advanced production methods get adopted by competitors quickly. This leads to everyone selling more for the same price. To make money, capitalists need to sell much more than before. The cost of production machinery also keeps increasing. The need to sell more becomes crucial for survival, leading to even fiercer competition. This constant pressure to be better fuels further development of division of labor and use of machinery. Competition drives down prices to the cost of production, taking away the profits from any production improvement. More efficient production, more output with same labor, forces even cheaper production to stay competitive. This creates a situation where capitalists gain nothing but the pressure to produce more in the same time, making it harder to use their capital profitably. To fight this pressure, capitalists constantly try to innovate with even better division of labor and new machines, despite their higher cost. Looking at this competitive pressure on a global scale, we see ever more specialized division of labor, continuous improvement of existing machinery, constant introduction of brand new machines. This entire process unfolds rapidly and on a massive, ever-growing scale. The passage argues that the growth of productive capital, with its increased division of labor and use of machinery, has a negative impact on wages. Here's the breakdown. Increased division of labor allows one worker to do the job of many, 5, 10, or 20 times more. This creates a situation where there's more competition among workers. Workers are forced to compete on price, who will work for less, and productivity, who can do more work. The author suggests this is driven by capital constantly improving the division of labor. This implies that wages may be driven down due to the increased competition among workers. The passage expands on the negative impact of growing productive capital on wages. Simplification of labor. Increased division of labor makes tasks simpler, requiring less skill. Devaluation of worker skills. This makes the specialized skills of workers less valuable. Fungible workforce. Simpler tasks become accessible to a wider pool of workers, increasing competition for jobs. Lower wage floor. Easier to learn tasks have lower training costs, putting downward pressure on wages, cost of production of labor. Dissatisfaction breeds lower wages. The passage suggests that as work becomes more monotonous and less fulfilling, workers may be willing to accept lower wages for it. In short, the argument here is that advancements in production methods through capital growth lead to a situation where there are more workers competing for simpler jobs, driving wages down. Here's the summary of the passage. Workers try to maintain wages by working more. The passage argues that workers, facing lower wages due to increased competition, try to maintain their overall income by working more hours or producing more in the same time frame. A vicious cycle. This attempt to work more actually worsens the situation, multiplies the disastrous effects. Increased competition through overwork. By working more, workers unintentionally increase competition for jobs. Race to the bottom. This pressure forces other workers to also work more or accept lower wages to stay competitive. Self-defeating cycle. Ultimately, workers end up competing against themselves and their fellow workers, driving wages down further. The passage suggests that this becomes a self-reinforcing cycle where workers' attempts to maintain income through increased work effort ironically lead to lower wages for everyone in the working class. Here's the summary of the passage. Workers try to maintain wages by working more. The passage argues that workers, facing lower wages due to increased competition, try to maintain their overall income by working more hours or producing more in the same time frame. A vicious cycle. This attempt to work more actually worsens the situation, multiplies the disastrous effects. Increased competition through overwork. By working more, workers unintentionally increase competition for jobs. Race to the bottom. This pressure forces other workers to also work more or accept lower wages to stay competitive. Self-defeating cycle. Ultimately, workers end up competing against themselves and their fellow workers, driving wages down further. The passage suggests that this becomes a self-reinforcing cycle where workers' attempts to maintain income through increased work effort ironically lead to lower wages for everyone in the working class. This passage describes the impact of machinery on the workforce, further supporting the argument of declining wages due to increased productive capital. Machines replace workers. Machinery eliminates the need for skilled workers, replacing them with unskilled labor. Women and children are mentioned. Job losses. Machinery introduction leads to mass layoffs initially, throws workers upon the streets in great masses. Gradual displacement. Even as machinery becomes more efficient, it continues to eliminate jobs, though at a slower pace, discards them in additional though smaller numbers. Here, the author uses a war analogy. Capitalist competition as war. Competition between capitalists is portrayed as an industrial war. Winning through layoffs. Success in this war is achieved by laying off the most workers, discharging the greatest number of industrial soldiers. This emphasizes the negative impact of machinery on workers' job security according to the passage. This passage describes the impact of machinery on the workforce, further supporting the argument of declining wages due to increased productive capital. Machines replace workers. Machinery eliminates the need for skilled workers, replacing them with unskilled labor. Women and children are mentioned. Job losses. Machinery introduction leads to mass layoffs initially, throws workers upon the streets in great masses. Gradual displacement. Even as machinery becomes more efficient, it continues to eliminate jobs, though at a slower pace, discards them in additional though smaller numbers. Here, the author uses a war analogy. Capitalist competition as war. Competition between capitalists is portrayed as an industrial war. Winning through layoffs. Success in this war is achieved by laying off the most workers, discharging the greatest number of industrial soldiers. This emphasizes the negative impact of machinery on workers' job security according to the passage. The passage here criticizes the optimistic view of economists regarding job displacement by machinery. Economists claim. The passage suggests economists argue that workers replaced by machines will find new jobs in other industries. Refuting the claim, the author finds this unconvincing. Facts cry out too loudly against this lie. They argue that new jobs might be created, but not necessarily for the same workers who lost theirs. New jobs for new workers. The new opportunities might benefit young people entering the workforce, not the displaced experienced workers. Cold comfort for displaced workers. This offers little comfort to those who lost their jobs due to machinery. Dead may bury their dead. Capitalist self-interest. The author suggests the economist's view prioritizes the needs of capitalists who rely on wage labor to function. Overall, this part highlights the disagreement between the author's view of machinery leading to worker hardship and the potentially rosier outlook of economists who see opportunities for new jobs. This passage continues the critique of economists' views on machinery and job displacement. Here's the breakdown. Even with new jobs, wages likely drop. Even if everyone displaced by machinery finds new work, the author doubts it will be as well-paying. Laws of political economy. This view is based on the idea that advancements in industry tend to replace higher-skilled jobs with simpler ones. Lower wages for displaced workers. If displaced workers have to take these simpler jobs, it suggests they'll likely face lower wages, paid more poorly. The argument here is that machinery doesn't just cause job losses, but also pushes workers towards lower-paying jobs, further reducing their overall income. This passage addresses a potential counterargument to the author's view on machinery and job losses. Exception: machine manufacturing jobs. The author acknowledges a possible exception: jobs created in the machine manufacturing sector itself due to the increased demand for machines. These jobs were supposedly skilled and well-paying. Technological advancements changed the game. However, the author argues that this is no longer true after 1840. Technological advancements like automation have changed machine manufacturing itself. Machines making machines. Now, complex machines are used to manufacture other machines, reducing the need for skilled labor. To skilled labor in machine manufacturing. The author suggests that workers in machine factories have become like very stupid machines themselves due to the repetitive and unskilled nature of their tasks. This part essentially argues that even the supposed high-skilled haven of machine manufacturing has been affected by advancements, leading to a decline in the quality and potentially the wages of these jobs. This passage highlights the author's view on the negative impact of machinery on working-class families. Machines replace breadwinners with lower-paid workers. The author argues that machines might replace a single adult worker man with several lower-paid workers, children and women. Family income threatened. This might not necessarily improve the overall family income, as the man's wages might have supported the entire family, 3 children and 1 woman. Minimum wage and survival needs. The passage suggests that these wages might not even meet the minimum needed to sustain a family, preservation and propagation of the race. Exploitation through cheap labor. The author criticizes the bourgeois phrases that might portray this as a positive development. They see it as exploitation through cheap child and female labor. More workers, lower living standards. Ultimately, the argument is that while more family members might be working, their combined income might not be enough to maintain the previous standard of living. That's a great summary. It captures the key points of the passage. Growth in productive capital leads to more division of labor and use of machinery. Increased division of labor and machinery create more competition among workers. This competition drives wages down for the working class. This passage expands on the negative impact of growing productive capital on the working class, adding another layer to the competition for jobs. Struggle pushes middle class into working class. The intense competition driven by advancements creates pressure on small business owners and those living off interest, likely from investments, forced to become laborers. These people may be forced to join the working class as they lose their own businesses or income sources. More competition, lower wages. This further increases the pool of workers competing for jobs, potentially driving wages even lower. The forest of outstretched arms grows ever thicker. Small businesses cannot compete. The passage suggests that smaller businesses cannot compete with the efficiency of large-scale production and are likely to fail. More workers, fewer opportunities. This translates to more people looking for work, proletariat, with potentially fewer opportunities available. In essence, this part argues that growing productive capital doesn't just hurt existing workers, it also creates a situation where more people are pushed into the working class, increasing competition and putting downward pressure on wages. This passage expands on the negative impact of growing productive capital on the working class, adding another layer to the competition for jobs. Struggle pushes middle class into working class. The intense competition driven by advancements creates pressure on small business owners and those living off interest, likely from investments, forced to become laborers. These people may be forced to join the working class as they lose their own businesses or income sources. More competition, lower wages. This further increases the pool of workers competing for jobs, potentially driving wages even lower. The forest of outstretched arms grows ever thicker. Small businesses cannot compete. The passage suggests that smaller businesses cannot compete with the efficiency of large-scale production and are likely to fail. More workers, fewer opportunities. This translates to more people looking for work, proletariat, with potentially fewer opportunities available. In essence, this part argues that growing productive capital doesn't just hurt existing workers, it also creates a situation where more people are pushed into the working class, increasing competition and putting downward pressure on wages. This final passage connects the ideas of growing productive capital and competition to the concept of economic crises. Here's the breakdown. Pressure to use existing capital more. The intense competition forces capitalists to fully utilize their ever-increasing production capacity. Increased reliance on credit. This might involve using credit systems more extensively to finance larger production. More frequent and severe crises. The passage argues that this situation leads to more frequent and severe economic crises. Industrial earthquakes. Why crises worsen? There are two reasons given: market saturation. As production increases, there are fewer new markets to expand into, the world market shrinks. Sacrifices during crises. Previous crises might have already exhausted the potential of existing markets. Sacrificing to the gods of the lower world. In essence, the passage argues that the very mechanisms that capitalists use to survive the cutthroat competition created by advancements in production, using more capital, credit, also set the stage for more frequent and severe economic crises. This final part of the passage is interesting because it introduces a seemingly contradictory statement. Let's break it down. Capital and worker deaths. The passage uses a dark metaphor to depict the human cost of economic crises. Capital is seen as a master dragging its slaves, workers, to their deaths during economic downturns. Favorable conditions for wage labor, paradox despite the grim imagery. The passage concludes by reiterating a seemingly contradictory point. It states that rapid capital growth, even with its negative consequences, is the most favorable condition for wage labor. This is where it's important to consider the author's perspective. The author is likely a critic of capitalism, highlighting the negative aspects of wage labor under a system driven by profit and competition. Possible interpretation. The statement about favorable conditions might be sarcastic. Rapid capital growth might be favorable, in the sense that it creates more jobs initially, but these jobs come at a high cost: lower wages, competition, worker displacement during crises. Overall, the passage isn't arguing that rapid capital growth is truly good for workers. It's more likely a critical commentary pointing out the harsh realities for wage laborers within a capitalist system.